Ever look back at, historical figures we see as heroes and then found out there's a really dark side you never knew about?
Happens more often than we'd like, probably.
Right. Well, today we're kind of doing that. We're focusing on Martin Luther, a huge figure, obviously, in the Protestant Reformation.
Absolutely central.
But this deep dive is specifically about one of his most disturbing works on the Jews and their lies.
Yeah, and it's important right up front to say that the sources we have are solid. There's really no serious historical doubt that Luther did write this.
Despite some people trying to claim it was a forgery or something.
Exactly. The historical evidence confirms it's him. And it's such a stark, shocking contrast to some of his earlier stuff, like that piece from 1523 that Jesus Christ was born a Jew. Much more tolerant back then.
Okay, so that's the core of what we want to unpack today, right?
Yeah.
How did he go from that earlier view to this really virulent anti-Semitism in the 1543 text? What happened?
It's a disturbing trajectory. The sources suggest his initial hope was that Jewish people would convert to his version of Christianity once the Catholic Church's issues were reformed.
He thought they'd see his way as the true way.
Kind of, yeah. But when large-scale conversions just didn't happen, his perspective seems to have darkened considerably. Frustration grew.
And turned into outright hostility.
It really did. He started, leaning heavily on those awful medieval Christian stereotypes and libels against Jews. Perhaps his conviction in his own theological rightness made him see their refusal to convert as this deliberate rejection of God's truth.
Which then fueled the anger.
It seems that way. The disappointment morphed into something much uglier.
So what exactly was he accusing them of on the Jews and their lies? What were the main charges?
Oh, it's a list of really offensive, deeply ingrained prejudices. He basically paints Jewish people as inherently deceitful, as blasphemers, and fundamentally as a danger to Christian society.
So pulling on those old damaging tropes.
Absolutely. He revives, and you could say amplifies many of them, like, the baseless stuff about ritual murder, poisoning wells, all those things that have been circulating for centuries and causing immense harm.
And it wasn't just talk, was it? The sources are clear. He went beyond accusations. He proposed actual measures. Horrifying ones, frankly.
Yes, and this is where it gets incredibly chilling. It wasn't just rhetoric. He laid out a specific, brutal plan.
Like what? What did he call for?
He advocated burning down synagogues and Jewish schools, destroying their centers of worship and learning.
Just wipe them out.
Essentially, he called for the destruction of their prayer books, forbidding rabbis from teaching or preaching, silencing their faith leaders.
It keeps going, doesn't it?
It does. Burning their homes, confiscating their property, their money, impoverishing them, forcing them into manual labor.
Or expulsion.
Or expulsion, yes. And maybe the more shocking part, denying them any legal protection or mercy, basically making them outlaws in their own lands.
It's hard to even hear that list. Just brutal.
It's profoundly disturbing, especially coming from such a major religious figure.
The sources mention the language must have been incredibly harsh, drawing a parallel to a verse in the Quran, 9.73, about harshness towards enemies. Can you explain that comparison a bit?
Yeah, and it's really important to be clear here. This comparison isn't about taking a stance on either religious text at all. It's purely to illustrate the intensity of Luther's language.
Just the level of hostility.
Exactly. Just as that specific Quranic verse in its context talks about being harsh against them, Luther's writing in this treatise is just saturated with this similar tone of unrelenting hostility, a demand for severe, uncompromising action against a whole people. The fervor is palpable.
Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier that the evidence for Luther's authorship is strong, and the sources really hammer this point, dismissing that Catholic forgery idea. Why is it so crucial to be absolutely clear he wrote it?
Well, because denying it is a way to kind of sidestep the uncomfortable truth about him, isn't it? It lets people off the hook from confronting this dark aspect of his legacy.
And the evidence is solid.
Overwhelmingly so. We have his own letters, like one to Georg Buchholzer in 1543, where he talks about his anti-Jewish writings and his disappointment about conversions.
So contemporary proof.
Right. Plus, the publication history of On the Jews and Their Lies is well documented. Original copies still exist. There's one in the Bavarian State Library, for example.
And the writing itself. Does it sound like him?
Completely. The style, the theology, the way he argues, it all lines up perfectly with his other known works. The forgery claim really has no credible historical leg to stand on.
Which leads us to, well, an even darker chapter, how the Nazis used this text centuries later. The sources say they actively exploited it.
Yes. This is where the historical impact becomes truly horrifying. Luther's work, sadly, provided a kind of historical and, for them, theological justification that the Nazis seized upon.
How did they use it specifically?
They republished it. They distributed it widely as propaganda. They wanted to legitimize their own antisemitism by linking it back to this major German figure.
So trying to give their hatred historical roots.
Precisely. There were documented cases, like at that big Nazi rally in Nuremberg in 1939, where they handed out excerpts from Luther's treatise. They were deliberately drawing that line.
And they weren't subtle about it.
Oh, absolutely. Luther was a forerunner to their own violence. You can almost see Luther's call to burn synagogues echoed in the actual destruction during Kristallnacht.
And didn't this come up at the Nuremberg trials after the war?
It did, starkly. Julius Streicher, the editor of that vile newspaper, Der Stürmer, he explicitly used Luther's writings in his defense.
Seriously? What did he say?
He basically said something like, if this book by Luther was being considered a crime, then Luther himself should be standing there in the dock with him.
Wow. That's a chilling endorsement. It shows how directly they saw the connection.
It absolutely does. They viewed themselves as fulfilling Luther's recommendations.
The sources also mention a Bishop Martin Sasse, who wrote a pamphlet linking Luther directly to Kristallnacht. That seems particularly awful.
It's profoundly disturbing. His pamphlet from 1938 was literally titled, Martin Luther on the Jews, Away with Them. He explicitly connects Luther's words to the violence of Kristallnacht.
Kristallnacht being the night of broken glass, those pogroms in November 1938.
Yes, the coordinated attacks, burning synagogues, destroying businesses, arresting thousands of Jewish men on November 9th and 10th, 1938.
And that timing. November 10th is Luther's birthday, isn't it?
It is, November 10th, 1483.
Was that timing deliberate by the Nazis? Or just a coincidence they latched onto?
The sources strongly suggest it was either deliberate or, at minimum, they eagerly exploited the coincidence. Bishop Sasse himself called the pogrom the fulfillment of the great German reformer's will.
That just underscores how much they wanted to wrap their actions in Luther's legacy. Applause seems needed here. It's really heavy stuff.
It is. Thinking about the real-world consequences of words written centuries earlier, it's sobering.
So, given all this undeniable history, why have some Protestants tried to deny he wrote it, or maybe just downplay how bad it was?
That's a really important question, touching on how we deal with flawed historical figures, right? I think often it stems from, embarrassment. It's hard to reconcile this hatred with the figure revered in Protestantism.
So cognitive dissonance, maybe?
Sort of. Some try the argument that, it's just the times, and yes, anti-Semitism was tragically widespread. But that doesn't really excuse Luther's specific and extreme calls for violence and persecution. He went further than many.
And the forgery theories, as we said.
They just don't hold up to historical scrutiny. Really, attempts to deny or minimize it just get in the way of an honest reckoning with this part of history.
Were there people back then, maybe other Christians, who pushed back against this kind of talk?
That's a good point. Was there contemporary criticism? The sources don't focus heavily on that, but it's worth remembering dissent wasn't always widely recorded or easy. But the main point remains. The main point is the undeniable impact. Martin Luther, a foundational figure in Western thought, wrote this tract advocating severe persecution. And that tract was later picked up and weaponized by the Nazis.
Effectively used to help justify genocide.
Tragically, yes. Acknowledging this dark part of his legacy is just essential if you want to understand the long, painful history of anti-Semitism. It wasn't just the Nazis either. Did Luther's views influence attitudes towards Jews in other, maybe less direct ways over the centuries?
That's a complex question, the broader ripple effect. But certainly, having such a prominent figure voice, these ideas couldn't have helped.
No, it couldn't have. It lent a certain theological weight, perhaps, to existing prejudices for some.
So what we've uncovered in this deep dive is pretty stark. A hugely influential historical figure wrote something calling for brutal persecution. And centuries later, one of history's most evil regimes used it to fuel their own atrocities.
That's the disturbing core of it.
And it leaves us, and you listening, with some really tough questions, doesn't it? How do we balance the good things historical figures did with their serious flaws, especially when those flaws had such devastating consequences?
And what's our responsibility now? How do we confront these uncomfortable truths from the past?
Yeah, what do we owe it to ourselves and to history to make sure that kind of rhetoric is never allowed to take root and cause such horror again? It's definitely something to think about.
A lot to mull over.
Absolutely. We really encourage you to look deeper into the history of anti-Semitism and into Luther's life. It's complex, it's contradictory. This conversation needs to keep happening.